Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The late summer sun of North Carolina filtered through the leaves of the old oak trees, lining the quiet suburban street in Mount Holly. It was a place of neatly kept lawns, the distant hum of cicadas, and the laughter of children playing in backyards. Inside one of the comfortable two-story homes, Stacy Hunsucker moved with the easy grace of a woman content in her world. At 32, she was a vibrant mother of 2 young daughters, a woman whose smile was a familiar and welcome sight at the local preschool where she worked. Her life, woven from the simple threads of family, church, and community, seemed as sturdy and reassuring as the town itself. She and her husband, Joshua Hunsucker, were high school sweethearts, a local love story that had culminated in a life many of their peers admired. Joshua, a flight paramedic for Atrium Health's MedCenter Air, possessed a confident, capable air. His job was one of high stakes and adrenaline, plucking people from the jaws of death, a hero in a flight suit. Together, they were raising their daughters, Piper and Willow, in a home filled with the crayon drawings and scattered toys that are the hallmarks of a happy childhood. To the outside world, the Hunsuckers were the embodiment of the American dream, a picture-perfect family rooted in the heart of Gaston County. But behind the placid facade of their life, a current of something darker was beginning to stir. It was subtle at first, a discordant note in the melody of their domestic life, a secret Joshua carried with the same hidden weight as the medical supplies in his flight bag. Friends would later recall moments of unease, a certain coldness in Joshua's gaze, a dismissiveness towards Stacy that felt out of place. But these were fleeting impressions, easily dismissed. Stacy herself, ever the optimist, poured her energy into her children and her work, a radiant force of kindness and positivity. She was, as a friend from her church would later say, a person who only brought goodness wherever she went. She couldn't have known that a shadow was lengthening over her home, a darkness that emanated not from some external threat, but from the man who slept beside her every night. On September 23, 2018, the carefully constructed world of Stacy Hunsucker came to a sudden and horrifying end. The day had been unremarkable, another page in the family calendar. But as evening settled, Joshua Hunsucker made a frantic call. He had found his wife slumped over the side of their living room couch, unresponsive, her skin turning a terrifying shade of blue. When paramedics, Joshua's own colleagues, arrived, they found him performing CPR on his wife. The scene was chaotic, infused with a strange and unsettling energy. Joshua, the trained medical professional, seemed oddly detached, his actions mechanical. Stacy was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. At the age of 32, the bright, loving mother was pronounced dead. The initial diagnosis was swift and, given her age and apparent good health, shocking: a heart attack. Myocardial infarction, a catastrophic failure of the body's most vital organ. In the immediate aftermath, as grief should have enveloped the home, an unnerving quiet took its place. Joshua's accounts of what happened in the moments before he found Stacy began to shift and warp, the details changing with each telling. To the police on the scene, he claimed he had stepped outside briefly to check that the car doors were locked, worried about a recent spate of break-ins in the neighborhood. To one friend, he said he had gone for a walk to burn off some energy. To another, he mentioned being out back, cutting wood for some signs he was making. And to Stacy's own mother, Susie Robinson, he offered yet another version. He had been sitting at the kitchen table, his back to the living room, working on his computer. When he turned around, he saw her, lifeless on the couch. For different stories for the last moments of his wife's life, each one a small crack in the foundation of his credibility. The questions, at first, were whispers. Why was he so unaffected? Co-workers who saw him in the days following Stacy's death were startled by his composure, his lack of visible grief. He seemed to move on with an unnerving speed. The funeral arrangements were handled not by the grieving husband, but by Stacy's heartbroken parents, John and Susie Robinson. Joshua's focus was elsewhere. Almost immediately after Stacy's death, he pushed for cremation, a decision that would forever destroy any physical evidence left on her body. And just 2 days after his wife's heart supposedly gave out, he filed a claim on her $250,000 life insurance policy. Within months, the whispers grew into a roar. A new woman was in Joshua's life, a girlfriend who soon moved into the home he had shared with Stacy. Her presence a jarring intrusion into the space where a wife and mother's memory was still fresh. For Stacy's parents, the grief was compounded by a gnawing suspicion. Their son-in-law's actions didn't align with the image of a devastated widower. Susie Robinson, armed with a mother's intuition and the painful knowledge of Joshua's affair, a relationship he had started while Stacy was still alive, decided to act. She could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She picked up the phone and called the insurance company, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel a truth far more sinister than a simple, tragic heart attack. The call from Susie Robinson to the North Carolina Department of Insurance triggered an investigation that started with a single damning question. Why would a healthy 32-year-old woman suddenly die of cardiac arrest? Special agents from the Criminal Investigations Division began to dig, and the inconsistencies in Joshua Hunsucker's story became impossible to ignore. His behavior was a constellation of red flags: the affair, the quick cremation, the immediate life insurance claim, the conflicting alibis. But suspicion alone was not enough. They needed proof, a concrete piece of evidence to turn their theory into a case. The investigators hit a wall. Stacy's body had been cremated, and with the ashes went any chance of a traditional autopsy. It seemed Joshua had succeeded in erasing his tracks. But then a detail emerged that would change everything. Stacy Hunsucker, a woman who brought goodness wherever she went, had made one final, posthumous act of generosity. She was a registered organ donor. The designation, meant to give life to others in the event of her death, now served a different purpose. It offered her a voice from beyond the grave. Because she was a donor, a routine blood sample had been drawn and preserved by the organ donor lab after her death. It was a vial of blood, forgotten in a file, a time capsule of the last moments of her life. Investigators secured a search warrant and sent the sample for a comprehensive toxicology screening. The wait was agonizing. Everything hinged on what that small vial of blood would reveal. When the results came back, they were chilling. Stacy's blood contained an abnormally high concentration of a chemical called tetrahydrozoline. It was not a substance that should have been there. Tetrahydrozoline is the active ingredient in over-the-counter eye drops and nasal sprays, products like Visine. While harmless when used as directed, it is a potent poison when ingested. It constricts blood vessels, and in large doses can slow the heart rate to a stop, inducing cardiac arrest. It was a nearly undetectable method of murder, one that would mimic the symptoms of a natural heart attack. Stacy hadn't died, she had been killed. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation. Suddenly, other pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Investigators interviewed Joshua's colleagues at MedCenter. 2 of his former co-workers came forward with a horrifying story. They told investigators that before Stacy's death, Joshua had casually remarked that if he were ever to kill someone, he would use Visine or other eye drops. It was a boast, a dark fantasy shared among colleagues, that now sounded like a confession. His training as a paramedic gave him a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology. He knew precisely how different substances affected the human body. He had access to medications and knew which ones were not routinely logged or inventoried. He had the knowledge, the access, and it seemed the inclination. The case against him was no longer just circumstantial. The motive was the $250,000 life insurance payout he had so eagerly pursued, receiving over $200,000 before his arrest. The weapon was a common household product. The proof was in his late wife's blood. On December 19, 2019, more than a year after Stacy's death, the charade was over. Special agents arrested Joshua Hunsucker, then 35, and charged him with first-degree murder. The news stunned the community of Mount Holly. The man they knew as a heroic flight paramedic, a devoted husband and father, was now accused of being a cold-blooded killer who had poisoned his wife for money. He was booked into the Gaston County Jail, his picture-perfect life shattered, the dark truth behind the facade finally exposed to the world. After his arrest, Joshua Hunsucker was held without bond, but his time in custody was brief. His defense team argued for his release, and he was eventually granted a staggering $1.5 million bond. He paid it and walked out of jail, returning to the same community where his wife's family lived, a constant, menacing presence. He was fitted with an ankle monitor and subjected to a curfew, but for Stacy's parents, John and Susie Robinson, his freedom was a living nightmare. They were not just grieving parents. They were now the primary witnesses in the murder case against their son-in-law, and he was living just miles away. What followed was not the quiet contrition of a man facing the gravest of charges, but a bizarre and escalating campaign of intimidation and deception. Joshua seemed to unravel, his actions growing more erratic and dangerous. He began to harass the Robinsons, engaging in a pattern of behavior designed to terrorize them into silence. He would drive by their house repeatedly, sometimes slowly, other times just parking nearby, a silent, looming threat. He was seen filming them in public places, following them as they went about their daily lives. The harassment even followed them to their place of worship. In the parking lot of their church, he would make vulgar gestures, a public display of his contempt and aggression. He sent a package to their home, demanding they drop the charges. His attempts to undermine the case grew more desperate and elaborate. In February 2023, he staged a bizarre and violent event, casting himself as the victim. He called the police with a shocking story. He claimed he had been attacked while changing a flat tire on the side of the road. He alleged that his father-in-law, John Robinson, had pistol-whipped him in the head, zip-tied his hands, and injected him with an unknown substance. It was a dramatic and detailed accusation, a clear attempt to frame John Robinson and portray him as a violent man capable of anything, perhaps even capable of harming his own daughter, Stacy. But when authorities investigated, they found no evidence to support his claim. The story fell apart under scrutiny. It was a poorly fabricated kidnapping, a desperate ploy to shift responsibility from the defendant to the Robinsons for his wife's death, as prosecutors would later state in court documents. The staged kidnapping was not his only alleged act of public mayhem. In an entirely separate incident before his murder charge, Joshua had been accused of starting a fire on an Atrium Health medical helicopter while he was working as a paramedic. The pilot was forced to make an emergency landing. This act of arson, prosecutors would argue, was part of a pattern of destructive and reckless behavior that demonstrated his disregard for law and human life. But the most depraved act was yet to come. While out on bond, Joshua still had access to his 2 young daughters. On February 24, 2023, just 20 days after he faked his own kidnapping, his older daughter, then just 10 years old, fell gravely ill. She was suffering from symptoms that were eerily familiar: low blood pressure, a dangerously low heart rate, extreme exhaustion, and constricted blood vessels. She was hospitalized, her small body struggling against an unknown ailment. When doctors ran tests, they made a horrifying discovery. Her urine sample contained tetrahydrozoline, the very same chemical used to kill her mother. As if that weren't enough, they also found a drug commonly prescribed for depression, a medication that was not approved for children and that investigators had previously found in a bag inside Joshua's truck. While his daughter was receiving treatment, Joshua reportedly suggested to medical staff that it seemed she had been given eye drops, a conclusion prosecutors noted was not reasonable based on her symptoms alone. Prosecutors alleged the unthinkable. that Joshua Hunsucker had poisoned his own child. They contended it was another twisted attempt to implicate John and Susie Robinson, to create a narrative where the grandparents were poisoning their own grandchild in some kind of vendetta. The poisoning of his daughter, they argued in court, was once again done with an attempt to implicate Mr. and Mrs. Robinson in the death of his wife and remove the Robinsons from the lives of his daughters. It was an act of unimaginable cruelty, using his own child as a pawn in his deadly game. The mounting evidence of witness intimidation, the faked kidnapping, and the alleged poisoning of his daughter finally led prosecutors to act. On August 6, 2024, a grand jury indicted Joshua Hunsucker on new charges: 4 counts of felony witness intimidation and 4 counts of misdemeanor obstruction of justice. He was arrested again, his time on the outside brought to an end. At a court hearing in November 2024, prosecutors laid out the full scope of his alleged actions while on bail. They argued that he was a clear and present danger to his children and his in-laws, and that his dangerous actions will continue to escalate. Inside the courtroom, Joshua Hunsucker stood in an orange jumpsuit, showing no emotion as the judge revoked his bond for the first-degree murder charge. He would remain behind bars, his freedom finally rescinded. Stacy's family, who had endured years of fear and harassment, sat on the courtroom benches, watching as the man accused of taking their daughter's life and terrorizing their family was led away in handcuffs. The trial, once planned for early 2025, was pushed back. Justice would have to wait a little longer, but for the first time in years, the Robinsons could breathe without fear. The case of Stacy Hunsucker is a story of profound betrayal. It is a story of a love that began in the innocence of high school and ended in the cold calculation of murder. It is the story of a man who wore the uniform of a hero while allegedly plotting the death of his wife, the mother of his children, for a sum of money that could never replace the life he destroyed. Joshua Hunsucker, the flight paramedic who was supposed to save lives, stands accused of masterfully taking one, using his expert medical knowledge to devise a nearly perfect crime. He almost succeeded. If not for Stacy's selfless decision to be an organ donor and her mother's unshakable instinct that something was wrong, he might have gotten away with it. He would have been the grieving widower, a pillar of strength for his 2 young daughters, his dark secret buried forever with his wife's ashes. Instead, he sits in a jail cell, his name now synonymous with a monstrous deception. The wake of his alleged crimes is a field of devastation. 2 young girls are left without a mother, their lives forever scarred by a tragedy they are too young to fully comprehend. One of them carries the additional trauma of allegedly being poisoned by her own father, her body used as a weapon in his war against her grandparents. John and Susie Robinson lost their daughter, and then had to endure years of psychological torment at the hands of the man they had once called family. They fought for justice for Stacy, even as he allegedly tried to frame them, harass them, and break their spirits. Joshua Hunsucker awaits his trial, which has been delayed by the litany of new charges against him. He is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. But the evidence compiled by prosecutors paints a portrait of a man without a conscience, a man capable of the ultimate betrayal. The community of Mount Holly, once a symbol of idyllic suburban life, now serves as the backdrop for a story of unthinkable darkness. It is a reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, can live next door, and can shatter the illusion of a perfect life with a few colorless, odorless, and deadly drops. The final chapter in the tragic story of Stacy Hunsucker has yet to be written, but for her family, the wait for justice is a testament to their enduring love for a woman whose goodness could not be extinguished, even in death. Story 2. In the quiet suburb of Binningen, just a stone's throw from the bustling city of Basel, Switzerland, the morning of February 13th, 2024, dawned like any other in the life of Christina Joksimovic. The 38-year-old former model and catwalk coach rose early, her golden hair catching the soft light filtering through the curtains of their spacious semi-detached home, a place that symbolized the stability she had worked so hard to build. Christina, with her warm smile and poised grace, had once graced the stages of beauty pageants, earning the title of Miss Northwest Switzerland in 2007 and reaching the finals of the National Miss Switzerland competition that same year. Those days of glamour seemed a distant memory now, replaced by the joyful chaos of raising her two young daughters, whom she adored with a fierce, protective love. As she prepared breakfast, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the chatter of her children, there was no hint of the tragedy that would unfold within these walls. Christina's journey had begun in the picturesque landscapes of Switzerland, where she grew up embracing the values of family and ambition. From a young age, she displayed a natural elegance, turning heads in her small town with her striking features and confident demeanor. It was in 2007, at the height of her early 20s, that Christina stepped into the spotlight of the Miss Switzerland pageant. Crowned Miss Northwest Switzerland, she carried the hopes of her region onto the national stage, competing against dozens of other hopefuls in a whirlwind of rehearsals, interviews, and runway walks. Though she didn't claim the ultimate crown, that went to Amanda Ammon, her performance was memorable, showcasing not just her beauty, but her poise and intelligence. Friends from that era recall her as bubbly yet grounded, someone who dreamed big but always returned home to those she loved. After the pageants, Christina transitioned seamlessly into a career as a catwalk coach, mentoring aspiring models and sharing the lessons she had learned under the bright lights. Her classes were popular in Basel, where she taught with patience and enthusiasm, encouraging her students to find confidence beyond appearances. It was during this fulfilling chapter that she met Thomas, a Swiss national 10 years her junior in some accounts, though their connection was immediate and intense. They married in 2017, in a ceremony that blended tradition with joy, surrounded by family and friends who saw in them a perfect match. Thomas, described by acquaintances as charming and attentive, provided the stability Christina sought after her high-profile past. Together, they welcomed two daughters, whose laughter filled the home and seemed to solidify their picture-perfect life. Yet, beneath the surface of this idyllic existence, cracks began to form. Neighbors in the affluent Binningen area spoke of the couple as enviable, hosting barbecues, taking family outings, and posting idyllic snapshots on social media. Just 4 weeks before the fateful day, Christina shared photos from a luxurious couple's getaway, her arm linked with Thomas's as they smiled against a scenic backdrop, their daughters playfully in tow. "A weekend to recharge," she captioned it, her words radiating contentment. But those close to her whispered of tensions, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Police had been called to their home on previous occasions for reports of domestic disturbances, though details remained private, shielded by the family's desire for discretion. Christina, ever the optimist, confided in friends that things would improve, that Thomas's occasional outbursts were stresses from work, nothing more. As the evening of February 12th approached, the air in the Joksimovic household grew heavy with unspoken words. Christina, exhausted from a day of coaching and errands, returned home to find Thomas in a brooding mood, his usual charm replaced by a simmering irritability. The children, sensing the shift, retreated to their rooms with toys and books, leaving the couple to navigate the fragile piece of dinner. What began as a minor disagreement, perhaps over household responsibilities or lingering resentments, escalated into something far more sinister. Thomas later claimed that Christina lunged at him with a kitchen knife, forcing him to act in self-defense. But the autopsy would tell a different story, one of deliberate violence without provocation. In the dim light of the kitchen, hands trembling with rage, Thomas wrapped his fingers around Christina's throat. She struggled, her eyes wide with shock and fear, gasping for air as the life she had built slipped away. The struggle was brief but brutal, marked by signs of blunt force trauma that spoke of a fight for survival. When it was over, Christina lay still on the cold tile floor, her golden hair splayed like a halo, a stark contrast to the violence that had just transpired. Panic seized Thomas, not remorse, as he surveyed the scene. The house, once filled with her laughter, now echoed with silence broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. What followed was an act of chilling calculation, driven by a desperate need to erase the evidence of his crime. Thomas dragged Christina's body to the laundry room, a utilitarian space tucked away from the children's play area, where the washing machine and dryer stood as silent witnesses. There, in the sterile glow of a single bulb, he set to work. Armed with a jigsaw, a sharp knife, and garden shears retrieved from the garage, he dismembered her remains with methodical precision. The sounds, the whir of the power tool, the snip of shears, must have reverberated through the quiet night, a macabre symphony hidden behind closed doors. Blood stained the floor, but Thomas pressed on, his mind clouded by what investigators would later describe as indications of mental illness. Not content with mere dismemberment, he took the horror further, pureeing portions of her body in a hand blender, the appliance whirring grotesquely as flesh and bone yielded to its blades. He then attempted to dissolve the remnants in a chemical solution, pouring it over the evidence in a bid to obliterate all traces. Hours passed in this nightmarish labor, the laundry room transforming into a scene from a nightmare. By dawn, the most incriminating parts were concealed. Her decapitated head, with its distinctive golden hair, stuffed into a bin bag, along with other fragments. Thomas cleaned meticulously, wiping surfaces and disposing of tools, convincing himself that he could resume normalcy. The children slept unaware in the next room, their innocence a heartbreaking counterpoint to the depravity unfolding nearby. February 13th brought no relief, only the weight of deception. As the day wore on, the local nursery grew concerned. Christina, always punctual, had not arrived to collect her daughters. A call went out to her parents, who lived not far away, their worry mounting with each unanswered ring. Christina's father, a man of quiet strength, drove to the Binningen home, his heart heavy with foreboding. Thomas answered the door with feigned nonchalance, shrugging off their questions about Christina's whereabouts. "She leaves sometimes," he said casually, inviting them inside as if it were a social visit. For hours, he maintained the charade, chatting idly with her father about the weather, preparing dinner for the grandchildren, even tucking them into bed with stories and kisses. The normalcy was eerie, a mask over the monster within. As night fell again, Christina's father stepped out briefly to fetch his wife, leaving Thomas alone with the children. Upon returning, unable to shake his unease, he began a discreet search of the house. The upper floors yielded nothing, but descending to the laundry room, he noticed a bin bag bulging unnaturally in the corner. Peering inside, he saw a glimpse of golden hair, his daughter's hair, and the world shattered. Horror gripped him as he uncovered the decapitated head, the face he had kissed goodnight so many times now frozen in eternal silence. Screaming in agony, he fled from the garage, flagging down a passerby to call the police. Sirens wailed soon after, piercing the suburban calm, and Thomas was arrested on the spot, his facade crumbling under the weight of truth. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough, peeling back the layers of the Joksimovic family's facade. Police swarmed the home, forensic teams meticulously cataloging the scene. Blood spatter on the kitchen floor, tool marks in the laundry, traces of chemical residue in drains. An autopsy confirmed the unimaginable, strangulation as the cause of death, with no defensive wounds on Thomas to support his self-defense claim. The blender, shears, and jigsaw were recovered, each bearing microscopic evidence of the crime. Neighbors, interviewed in hushed tones, recalled the couple's outward harmony, but admitted to occasional raised voices echoing from the house. Friends of Christina, like former Miss Switzerland Christa Ragazzi, expressed profound shock, remembering her as lovely and compassionate. "I'm truly shocked," Ragazzi told reporters, her voice breaking. "My thoughts are with her two daughters." Thomas's interrogation revealed a man unraveling. Initially, he stuck to his story of finding her dead and panicking, dismembering in a haze of fear. But by March, during a crime scene reconstruction, he confessed fully, admitting to the strangulation but insisting it was provoked. Prosecutors painted a different picture, a high level of criminal energy, a chilling lack of empathy, and cold-blooded actions post-murder. Psychological evaluations uncovered concrete indications of mental illness, sadistic sociopathic traits that explained, but did not excuse, the brutality. Previous police reports of domestic violence resurfaced, detailing arguments that had escalated into physical confrontations, though Christina had always minimized them to protect her family. The federal court in Lausanne denied Thomas's appeal for release in September 2024, citing the ongoing danger he posed. The ruling detailed the autopsy's findings, underscoring the premeditated nature of the cover-up. Christina's family, devastated, rallied around the two young girls, now orphaned of their mother and facing the shadow of their father's actions. Her father, haunted by the image of that bin bag, spoke little publicly but channeled his grief into ensuring his granddaughter's care. Friends gathered in quiet vigils, sharing memories of Christina's vibrant spirit, the way she lit up rooms, her dedication to her students, her unwavering love for her children. "She was the heart of our circle," one said, tears flowing. "To see her gone like this, it's unbearable." As the case progressed into 2025, the Swiss justice system grappled with the complexities of mental health and intimate partner violence. Women's aid organizations decried the media coverage, urging focus on the systemic failures that allow such tragedies to occur. Christina's story became a somber reminder of hidden dangers in seemingly perfect homes, her life cut short at the peak of her motherhood. The daughters, too young to fully comprehend, grew under the watchful eyes of relatives, their mother's legacy living on in photos and stories whispered at bedtime. Thomas remained in custody, his trial looming as a quest for accountability. In the end, Christina Jaksimowic's narrative was one of promise unfulfilled, of love twisted into horror. Her golden hair, once a symbol of her pageant glory, became the thread that unraveled the lie. The Binningen house, once alive with family joys, stood empty, a ghost of what was lost. Yet through the pain, her memory endured, a beacon of resilience, urging society to listen to the silent cries behind closed doors. The emotional toll rippled outward, touching everyone who knew her, leaving an indelible mark on the community that had watched her shine. Story 3. The last day of February 2011 dawned crisp and clear over Shelbyville, Tennessee, a small town nestled in the rolling hills about an hour southeast of Nashville. It was a place where roots ran deep, where family was everything, and where the quiet hum of everyday life was a comforting melody. For Shelley Mook, a vibrant 24-year-old with a warm smile and a heart full of hope, it was a day of new beginnings. She had just spent the weekend moving into a new apartment, a fresh start after a tumultuous marriage. A dedicated 8th grade teacher at Harris Middle School, Shelley was adored by her students and colleagues, a bright light in the lives she touched. But the center of her universe, the very reason for her being, was her 6-year-old daughter, Liliana, or Lily, as she was affectionately known. A tattoo of a lily with a long stem graced Shelley's back, a permanent tribute to the little girl who was her world. That Monday, Shelley was a whirlwind of activity. She had taken a couple of days off from work to settle into her new home, arranging for a substitute teacher to cover her classes. She had an appointment with a handyman at 4:30 p.m. to help with the move-in chores. But first, she had to drop Lily off at the home of her ex-husband, Tyler Mook. Their relationship had been a stormy sea of love and pain, a high school romance that had blossomed into a marriage and then withered into a bitter divorce. They had married young, just after their senior year, with Shelley already pregnant with Lily. The dream of a happy family had quickly soured because of Tyler's abusive and cruel behavior. The marriage lasted 6 turbulent years before finally ending in 2009. Even after the divorce, the turmoil continued. Tyler had been charged with trying to run Shelley's car off the road and was a suspect in 2 incidents of vandalism at her home, though no charges were ever filed. Despite the acrimony, they shared a daughter, and so their lives remained intertwined. The custody arrangement placed Lily primarily with Shelley, with Tyler having visitation rights on Wednesday evenings and every other weekend. On this particular Monday, Shelley drove her white Pontiac Grand Prix down the long, gravel driveway of Tyler's house on Old Nashville Dirt Road. It was just after 3 p.m. She was seen outside the house with Lily, a fleeting image of a mother and daughter in the late afternoon sun. What happened next is a tapestry woven from the fragmented memories of a child and the self-serving lies of a man with a dark secret. The handyman arrived at Shelley's new apartment at 4:30 p.m., but she never showed. He called, but there was no answer. As the hours ticked by, a sense of unease began to creep into the hearts of those who loved her. Shelley was reliable, responsible. For her to miss an appointment, to be out of touch, was deeply out of character. For her to not pick up her daughter, as planned, was unthinkable. The following day, Tuesday, March 1st, the unease turned to full-blown panic. Shelley's family and her ex-husband, Tyler Mook, both contacted the police, reporting her missing. The quiet rhythm of Shelbyville had been broken by a discordant note of fear. Shelley Mook, a beloved teacher and devoted mother, had vanished without a trace. The investigation began immediately, a frantic search for a ghost. The first clue was a grim one. In the early hours of March 1st, at 12:30 a.m., a car was found ablaze in a remote farm field off of US 41A, southeast of Murfreesboro. It was a Pontiac Grand Prix, burned so completely that it was almost unrecognizable. After Tyler officially reported Shelley missing that afternoon, the registration was finally traced. It was Shelley's car. The fire, investigators determined, had been deliberately set, an accelerant used to ensure the destruction was absolute. The inferno had consumed any potential evidence, any stray hair or fingerprint that might have pointed to Shelley's fate. There were no human remains in the car, a small comfort in a sea of terrifying possibilities. But the location of the vehicle raised more questions than it answered. It had been driven down a long driveway and into a field, a secluded spot perfect for a clandestine act. This was not the work of one person. Someone had to have driven Shelley's car to this desolate location, while another followed to drive the perpetrator away from the scene. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation joined the search, a massive effort that scoured the land and water of Bedford County. They searched the CSX train yard in Cowan, a town less than an hour's drive from Shelbyville, acting on a tip that yielded nothing. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the area behind Tyler's home, their mournful bays echoing through the woods, finding nothing. Shelley Mook had been erased from the world. Detectives turned their attention to the last person known to have seen her alive, Tyler Mook. His story was a simple one, but riddled with inconsistencies. He claimed Shelley had been upset when she arrived, worried that her new boyfriend was being unfaithful. He said she came inside, and they talked for about an hour before she left to run errands, promising to return by 10 p.m. Her new boyfriend, however, had a rock-solid alibi and was quickly cleared as a person of interest. The most crucial witness was also the most vulnerable, 6-year-old Lily. A forensic specialist was brought in to interview the little girl, to gently probe her memories of that fateful afternoon. What she revealed was chilling. Lily said she had stayed in her car seat while her mom went into the house with her dad. Sometime later, her father came out to the car alone, took her out of her seat, and brought her inside to her old bedroom. He told her to stay there and not come out. She never saw her mother again. This was a stark contradiction to Tyler's account. He had become the sole person of interest in the disappearance of his ex-wife. When police arrived to conduct a thorough search of his home, they found he had already moved out. The next month, his address was listed as his parents' home. While he was somewhat cooperative with the investigation, he tellingly did not participate in any of the searches for the mother of his child. The disappearance of Shelley Mook was not just a missing person case. It was a custody battle, a legal war fought over the future of a little girl caught in the crossfire. Within days of Shelley's vanishing, her mother, Deborah Sikora, filed for custody of Lily. It was a desperate move, not only to protect her granddaughter, but also to force Tyler into a courtroom, to compel him to answer questions under oath. Tyler, along with his parents, Jim and Kim Mook, fought back, seeking to retain primary custody. The evidentiary hearing in July 2011 was a parade of horribles. Witness after witness testified to Tyler's dark side: his illegal drug use, his violent outbursts, his physical and verbal abuse of Shelley during their marriage. But the most shocking testimony came from Lily herself. The 7-year-old girl, her voice small but clear in the solemn courtroom, told the judge that her father and her paternal grandmother had talked to her about burning her maternal grandmother's house down. She said her father had offered to give her matches so she could light a fire under her grandmother's bed. Tyler denied the accusation, but the judge found Lily's story credible. Then came the deposition, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Tyler Mook, the last person to see Shelley alive, was finally under oath. But there were no answers, only a litany of defiance. On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds of the Fifth Amendment, he repeated, a monotonous shield against the barrage of questions. Over 150 times, he invoked his right against self-incrimination. He refused to say what he and Shelley had argued about after their divorce. He refused to say if Shelley had come to his house on the day she disappeared. He refused to say what time she left. But in a bizarre break from his pattern, when asked if he'd had sex with Shelley on that day, he answered, yes. When asked what time, he once again retreated behind the Fifth Amendment. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Tyler Mook was found unfit to be a parent, a substantial risk of harm to his own daughter. The court cited his dangerous temper, his involvement in drug dealing, and his irresponsible driving. The judge also denied the request for Tyler's parents to be named as primary caregivers, noting their denial of their son's numerous problems. For now, Lily was safe with her grandmother. As the legal battle raged, a careless mistake by Tyler provided a chilling glimpse into his mindset. He accidentally but dialed 911 from his back pocket, and for roughly 20 minutes, a recording machine captured a conversation between him and his father, Jim. The audio is murky, a cacophony of machinery and muffled voices, but some phrases cut through the noise with startling clarity. They can't prove nothing, Tyler is heard saying, and they know that. He talks about people seeing Sean's car going down the road that night, a reference to an unknown individual. He worries that investigators have trampled all over his rights. His father, in a voice heavy with resignation, says, they did everything they were possible to do. It was not a confession, but it was the voice of a man who believed he had gotten away with something, a man who saw himself as a victim, not a perpetrator. With the investigation stalled and his reputation in tatters, Tyler Mook did what so many men on the run do. He sought a new life, a new woman, a clean slate. In 2012, he moved to the sun-drenched coast of Florida, leaving the whispers and accusations of Shelbyville behind. There, he met Robin Donath, a 25-year-old single mother. At first, the relationship was a dream. Tyler was charming, attentive, the perfect boyfriend. They were happy, and Robin believed they were heading toward marriage. Then one day, Tyler showed off his new speedboat, its name emblazoned on the side, Mook Racing. He casually mentioned that his last name wasn't Cook, as he had led her to believe, but Mook. The small lie was a red flag, a crack in the carefully constructed facade. Robin, her curiosity piqued and a seed of doubt planted, did some research. What she found online terrified her. The stories of his missing ex-wife, the custody battle, the accusations of abuse. It was a horror story she had unknowingly stepped into. Her mother's advice was blunt: leave him. Now, Robin confronted Tyler, but he was a smooth talker, a master of manipulation. He had an excuse for everything, a plausible explanation for every dark corner of his past. He convinced her he had nothing to do with Shelley's disappearance, that he was the victim of a vindictive family and a biased legal system. And Robin, caught in the web of his charm, believed him. She stayed. It was a decision she would nearly pay for with her life. 2 years into their relationship, on a sunny Florida day, Robin, Tyler, his brother Andrew, and Andrew's girlfriend Nicole took the Mook Racing speedboat out on the intracoastal waterway. Tyler had been drinking, and his temper was already frayed because Robin had been running late. As they sped across the water, Robin grew nervous and asked him to slow down. He snapped. He shut off the motor, grabbed the sunglasses from her head, and snatched her phone as she was trying to call her mother. Then, with a chilling nonchalance, he threw her into the water. At first, Robin thought it was a joke, a cruel prank. But then Tyler jumped in after her, and the game turned deadly. He pushed her under the water, his hands on her shoulders, his face a mask of cold fury. She fought back, gasping for air, her lungs burning. From the boat, Andrew heard her desperate cries for help and, in a moment of familial betrayal that would later save Robin's life, he jumped in. He wrapped his brother in a headlock, restraining him just long enough for Robin to swim away, to be pulled to safety by another boat. The dream was over. The monster was real. Charges were filed immediately, escalating from battery to attempted first-degree murder after detectives from Tennessee flew to Florida to speak with Robin. The trial was a stark look into the soul of Tyler Mook. Robin took the stand, her voice trembling but firm, as she recounted the terrifying attack. "I just started swimming," she said. "I knew I had to get away from him." Shelley Mook's mother and family were there in the courtroom, a silent show of support for another woman who had fallen prey to Tyler's violence. But the most powerful testimony came from Tyler's own brother. Andrew Mook, his loyalty to his brother broken by the horror he had witnessed, testified against him. He described how Tyler had pushed Robin under the water, how she had called for his help, how he had been forced to put his own brother in a chokehold to stop the attack. Nicole, Andrew's girlfriend, corroborated the story. She recounted what Tyler had said when he got back on the boat, his words a chilling echo of the disrespect that had so enraged him. "No one disrespects me in front of my family," he had snarled. "I'll kill her." The jury found Tyler Mook guilty of attempted second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. His appeal, based on a claim of ineffective counsel, was rejected. Today, Shelley Mook is still missing. Her case is a cold one, a painful void in the lives of her family and friends. There has been no body, no crime scene, no confession. Tyler Mook, the only person of interest in her disappearance, sits in a Florida prison, a convicted felon, but not a convicted murderer. He is a man who, it is believed, had help in making his ex-wife disappear, help in disposing of her car, and perhaps help in watching his daughter on the day her mother was stolen from her. Lily, now a young woman, has grown up without a mother, in the shadow of a father who is a monster. The quiet town of Shelbyville holds its breath, still waiting for an answer, for justice for the bright young teacher who vanished on a winter's day. The devil may be in a prison cell, but the ghost of Shelley Mook still walks the hills of Tennessee, her story a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a charming smile and a familiar face. Story 4. The autumn of 1998 had settled over Howard County, Maryland, with a crisp, melancholic beauty. The leaves, having surrendered their summer green, blazed in defiant shades of ochre, crimson, and gold before spiraling to the earth. For Sarah Jane Rares, it was a season of profound and unsettling change. At 35, she was charting a new course, navigating the choppy waters of single motherhood and the quiet satisfaction of a life she was building on her own terms. Her small house on Meadowfield Court in the peaceful suburb of Elkridge was more than just a structure of wood and brick. It was a sanctuary, a declaration of independence for herself and her 16-month-old son, a beautiful, bright-eyed boy who was the undisputed center of her universe. Sarah was a woman of quiet brilliance, a statistician at the highly secretive National Security Agency, where her sharp mind wrestled with complex data and intricate patterns. Her colleagues and friends knew her as warm, kind, and generous, a person who moved through the world with an unassuming grace. She had navigated the demanding worlds of academia and national security, earning a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University while working at the NSA, a testament to her formidable intellect and work ethic. But the most complex equation she had ever faced was her own marriage. She had met Lorenzo Rares in a class at Hopkins, and their shared intellectual pursuits had blossomed into a romance that led to marriage in 1994. But the union had fractured under the weight of conflict and control. The birth of their son, instead of uniting them, had become another point of contention. Lorenzo grew jealous of the attention Sarah lavished on the baby. The marriage soured, curdling into a mixture of bitterness and fear. It culminated in an alleged altercation where Lorenzo tried to strike Sarah while she was holding their child, a terrifying moment that became the final, unpardonable breach. Sarah obtained a restraining order and, in the summer of 1998, filed for divorce. The divorce was not amicable. It was a bitter, draining battle for custody of their son. Sarah, who had once been part of a large, tight-knit Filipino family by marriage, now found herself on the outside, viewed as an adversary. The date for their divorce hearing was set for December 3rd, a day on the near horizon that promised closure and, she hoped, a final escape from the turmoil. In the meantime, she focused on her work, her son, and the simple joys of her newfound independence. The house on Meadowfield Court was her quiet harbor in a turbulent sea. On the evening of Saturday, November 14, 1998, the suburban tranquility was shattered. Sarah was on the phone with her close friend, Laura Billiter. It was a routine call between friends who spoke almost daily. The conversation was normal, unremarkable. And then abruptly it wasn't. The call cut out, but Billiter's answering machine continued to record. For 30 agonizing seconds, the machine captured a soundscape of pure terror, a muffled struggle, a gasp, the chaotic noise of a life being violently extinguished. It was a chilling, disembodied record of a murder. The next day, Sunday, November 15th, Laura Billiter grew increasingly worried. Sarah wasn't answering her phone. The strange, truncated message on her machine played over and over in her mind, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Finally, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, she called the police and requested a wellness check. When officers from the Howard County Police Department arrived at the neat, unassuming house on Meadowfield Court, they found the first sign of trouble at the back of the house. A shattered window pane in a basement door, a clear point of forced entry. They moved cautiously through the quiet home. In the kitchen, the telephone receiver was off the hook, another small, discordant detail in the silent tableau. They proceeded into the family room, and there, the quiet suburban evening exploded into a scene of unimaginable horror. Sarah Rares was on the floor, surrounded by an unnaturally large pool of blood that had soaked into the carpet and spattered across the walls and furniture. Even the innocent, brightly colored plastic of her baby's toys was stained with it. It was a scene of ferocious, unrestrained violence. Detective Nathan Rettig, a seasoned homicide investigator, would later say he would never forget it. The sheer brutality was breathtaking. Sarah had been stabbed and cut all over her body, with a concentration of deep, vicious wounds to her chest and abdomen. But the most horrific injuries were to her neck and hands. Detective Rettig looked at the scene, the bloody chaos frozen in time, and saw more than just a murder. He saw a message. He saw a crime of pure, unadulterated passion, an act of overkill. The wounds to her hands, he thought, were symbolic, almost ritualistic. It was as if the killer had sought to destroy her very agency, her ability to work, to create, to hold her child, to fight back. Rigor mortis had set in, and the blood was mostly dry. Rettig estimated she had been dead for at least 24 hours, placing her time of death squarely in the window of that terrifying, garbled voicemail. A quick search of the house confirmed that her son was not there and had been spared from witnessing the carnage. The investigation into the brutal murder of Sarah Rares had begun, and the first and most obvious shadow of suspicion fell upon her estranged husband, Lorenzo. The investigation moved swiftly in the hours after the discovery. The acrimonious divorce and the ongoing custody battle provided a powerful, ready-made motive. Friends told the police that Sarah was afraid of Lorenzo, painting a picture of a volatile and controlling man. Detectives brought him in for questioning. Lorenzo Rares was calm, almost detached. He flatly denied any involvement in his wife's murder and provided an alibi. He had been at home with his family on Saturday night. He told police he had last seen Sarah when he had picked up their son for the weekend. He even offered up a suspect of his own, suggesting that Sarah had been having an affair with a colleague from the NSA, a man he viewed with jealous suspicion. The investigators were skeptical. They went to the Raras family home in Parkville, a different world from Sarah's quiet Elkridge suburb. There they spoke with Lorenzo's brother, Mike, and his mother, a 63-year-old nurse named Amelia Domingo Raras. The family closed ranks. Mike corroborated his brother's alibi, stating that Lorenzo had been at home with him on the night of the murder until he, Mike, left for his own night shift job. Amelia, a woman who presented as a traditional, devout matriarch, claimed she had been working her shift at a local nursing home at the time of the murder. The police executed search warrants on the family home and on Lorenzo's car, but the searches yielded nothing. There were no blood-stained clothes, no murder weapon, no forensic link to the blood-soaked scene on Meadowfield Court. They investigated Lorenzo's claim about the affair, but that too proved to be a dead end. The man in question lived in another state and was more of a mentor to Sarah than a lover. The police took DNA samples from Lorenzo and his brother, Mike, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. The results came back, bringing with them a fresh wave of frustration. Bloody fingerprints on a wall in Sarah's home had been identified as a mixture of Sarah's blood and the blood of an unknown male. That male was not Lorenzo Raras. It was not his brother, Mike. Weeks bled into months. The vibrant colors of autumn gave way to the bleak, gray chill of winter. The investigation into Sarah's murder grew cold. The initial flurry of activity slowed to a crawl, the trail of clues seeming to vanish into thin air. For Sarah's friends and family, the lack of progress was an agony, a wound that could not begin to heal. The police had a victim and a crime of unimaginable brutality, but they had no suspect, no weapon, and a shrinking list of leads. The case file, thick with gruesome photos and dead-end reports, sat on Detective Reddig's desk, a silent daily rebuke. It seemed as though the savage killer who had butchered Sarah Raras in her own home might simply get away with it. Then, in the summer of 1999, nearly 10 months after the murder, a phone call came from a neighboring jurisdiction that cracked the case wide open. It was the kind of break that homicide detectives dream of, a voice from the last place they expected. An inmate at the Baltimore County Detention Center, a man named Edison George, had approached a detective with a story. His cellmate, he said, had been talking, bragging in fact. The cellmate, a 19-year-old kid named Ardale D. Tickles, who was in jail on an armed robbery charge, had confessed to a murder he thought he'd gotten away with. The details Tickles was boasting about were chillingly familiar. He spoke of a brutal stabbing of a woman in her home. The Baltimore County detective, sensing a connection, urged George to engage his cellmate in another conversation. This time, however, he would be wearing a wire. The clandestine recording captured Ardale Tickles in his own words, his voice a mixture of youthful bravado and chilling callousness. He recounted the murder, providing details that had never been released to the public, details that only the killer and the police could know. He described the layout of the house, the ferocity of the attack. It was the confirmation investigators needed. This troubled teenager was, without a doubt, the man whose bloody fingerprints had been left on the wall of Sarah Raras' home. But as Detective Reddig and his team listened to the crackling audio from the jailhouse wire, they were hit with an even more staggering revelation. Tickles wasn't just a random burglar who had turned violent. He hadn't acted alone. He stated clearly and unequivocally on the tape that he had been paid to do it. It was a contract killing, and then he delivered the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. He named the person who had hired him, the person who had paid him to butcher her own daughter-in-law. The name he spoke was Amelia Raras, the 63-year-old grandmother, Sarah's mother-in-law. The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. Suddenly, all the pieces began to shift, rearranging themselves into a new and horrifying picture. Amelia Raras, the quiet, church-going nurse who had presented herself as a concerned matriarch, was now the prime suspect in a murder-for-hire plot. The focus of the investigation narrowed with laser-like intensity. Detectives had to build a solid, prosecutable case, connecting the unassuming grandmother to the teenage killer. They quickly established that Amelia and Tickles had indeed known each other. They were co-workers at the same nursing home, where Amelia was a nurse and Tickles worked in a more menial capacity. Witnesses confirmed they had spoken at work. The connection was real. The next step was to confront Tickles directly. Armed with the damning tape recording, investigators pulled him into an interrogation room. Faced with his own recorded confession, the teenager's bravado crumbled. He confessed everything. He told them how Amelia had approached him, how she had complained bitterly about her daughter-in-law, Sarah. He said she had offered him money to kill her. The price for Sarah's life, he told them, was $3,000. Investigators pressed him to call Amelia, to get her to confess on a recorded line, but Tickles refused. The police had to find another way to corroborate his story. They delved into Amelia's financial records, and there they found it, a check written by Amelia, for a sum that corresponded with the amount Tickles claimed he had been paid. It was the physical evidence they needed, the link between the mastermind and her instrument. On August 24, 1999, detectives arrived at the Raras family home with an arrest warrant. They found Amelia Raras babysitting her grandson, Sarah's son. In a moment of surreal tragedy, the woman who had allegedly ordered the murder of the boy's mother was taken into custody while caring for him. The detectives handcuffed the 63-year-old grandmother and drove her to the Howard County Police Station. The interrogation that followed would lay bare the dark, twisted motive behind one of the most brutal crimes the county had ever seen. In the stark, sterile environment of the police interview room, Amelia Raras began as a picture of confused innocence. But detectives Ellsworth Jones and Glenn Case were relentless. They knew they were dealing with a woman who had orchestrated a horrific crime and maintained a facade of normalcy for nearly a year. They informed her she was being charged with conspiracy and solicitation to commit murder. They told her they knew she had hired Ardale Tickles. The psychological pressure mounted. Detective Jones repeatedly brought up the future of her grandson, warning her that if her own son, Lorenzo, was involved, the boy could be taken away from the family permanently. It was a calculated move, designed to exploit her role as a grandmother. Then, Detective Case placed a photograph on the table in front of her. It was a crime scene photo of Sarah's mutilated body. "This is what your money paid for," he said, his voice flat and cold. Amelia glanced at the photo and quickly looked away, but the gruesome image had been deployed. Initially, Amelia invoked her right to an attorney, and the questioning stopped. But as she was being led to the booking area, she wavered. She told Detective Jones she wanted to clarify something about the charges. She felt the charges of conspiracy and murder were too strong. She initiated the conversation again, and after being re-advised of her rights, she began to talk. And then the truth, as Amelia saw it, began to pour out. She spoke of her relationship with Sarah, painting a picture of a daughter-in-law who was insolent and disrespectful. She recounted incidents, her voice rising with indignation, culminating in a story of how Sarah had allegedly spat in her face during an argument. This act, in her eyes, was an unforgivable transgression against her authority, against her position as the family matriarch. She admitted she had complained about Sarah to her co-workers, including Ardale Tickles. She admitted she gave him Sarah's address. She admitted she paid him. But she insisted, her voice pleading, that she never wanted him to kill Sarah. She claimed she had only hired him to stone the house, to scare her, to exact a measure of revenge for the disrespect she had endured. But as the interrogation wore on, her carefully constructed denials began to crack. In a moment of chilling clarity, she revealed the cultural and personal code that had driven her to such a monstrous act. During a heated exchange with the detectives, she was recorded uttering the words that would come to define the entire case, a phrase that laid bare the terrifying simplicity of her motive. Showing disrespect to a mother is death. With her confession, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Amelia confirmed that her sons, Lorenzo and Mike, knew nothing of her plot, and their names were officially cleared. The grandmother who had smiled and served coffee to the detectives investigating her daughter-in-law's murder was now facing charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. The legal proceedings that followed moved on two separate tracks. Ardale Tickles, the 19-year-old who had carried out the brutal attack, expressed remorse for his actions. On March 13, 2000, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Amelia Reyes, however, chose a different path. She pleaded not guilty, clinging to her story that she had never intended for Sarah to be killed. Her case went to trial in January 2000. For a week, the courtroom listened to the horrifying story of a family feud that had escalated into a savage murder. Prosecutors laid out their case with methodical precision, presenting the jury with the wiretapped confession of the hitman, the financial records that proved the payment, and most powerfully, Amelia's own incriminating words from her police interrogation. The jury deliberated for 18 hours, an unprecedented length of time for the Howard County Courthouse, wrestling with the image of the 63-year-old grandmother and the brutal crime she had set in motion. Shortly after midnight on a Friday in early February, they returned with their verdict. They found Amelia Reyes guilty of first-degree murder and solicitation to commit murder. At her sentencing, Amelia cried and addressed the court, still maintaining a version of her innocence. "I would like to say to the honorable court that I had no intention at all to kill Sarah," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm very, very sorry that it happened." The judge was unmoved. Looking down at the weeping grandmother, he described her not as a misguided woman seeking revenge, but as an evil person who lacked any real remorse for the life she had destroyed. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Sarah Reyes is a tragedy that resonates with a profound and disturbing chill. It is the story of a brilliant and beloved young woman who was just beginning to build a life of her own, only to have it stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. It is the story of a little boy who would grow up without his mother, his grandmother imprisoned for her murder, his family name forever linked to an infamous crime. And at its heart, it is a chilling testament to the destructive power of a wounded ego, a dark tale of how a perceived slight, a feeling of disrespect, could fester in the heart of a family matriarch and curdle into a hatred so potent that it would demand a payment in blood. Justice was served in the courts of Maryland, but the house on Meadowfield Court stands as a silent monument to a life cut short, and to the terrifying truth that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones disguised as family. Story 5. The transaction was simple, a small-time deal in a world where side hustles were a way of life. In the sprawling city of Memphis, Tennessee, where the rhythm of the blues mingled with the hard realities of the streets, Eddie Tate too had carved out a niche for himself. He was a young man with an entrepreneurial spirit, and his currency was beauty. He sold hair weaves, bundles of human hair that could transform a look, boost confidence, and for him, provide a living. His clients found him through word of mouth and social media, a digital marketplace where reputation was everything. On a cold day in January 2016, a new customer entered his orbit, a 19-year-old girl named Shelby Isaac. Shelby was, by all accounts, an ordinary teenager navigating the complex currents of young adulthood. She had no criminal record, no history of violence. Like many young women her age, she was invested in her appearance, and the allure of high-quality hair extensions was strong. She contacted Eddie Tate and arranged to buy $250 worth of weaves. The meeting was unremarkable, a quick exchange of cash for goods in Tate's car. Shelby left with her purchase, and Tate went about his day. It was a transaction like any other, a minor note in the symphony of their lives. But this note would soon swell into a discordant, horrifying crescendo. Eddie Tate, known as EJ to his friends and family, was more than just a purveyor of hair. He was a son, a cousin, a father. His mother, Gloria Tate, spoke of a bond with her only child that was inseparable. His life was intertwined with that of his girlfriend, Edwina Thomas. Their love story was about to enter a new chapter. Edwina was 8 weeks pregnant, her body nurturing the fragile promise of a new life. They were a young couple on the cusp of creating a family, their future a canvas of shared dreams and quiet hopes. But a seed of dissatisfaction had been planted in Shelby Isaac's mind. She was unhappy with the hair weaves. The reason for her displeasure remains murky, lost in the chasm between a minor complaint and a monstrous act. What is clear is that she wanted her money back, $250, a sum that, in the grand scheme of things, was trivial, but in the fractured logic that would soon govern her actions, it became a debt that could only be settled in blood. Shelby decided she would not simply ask for a refund. She would orchestrate a ruse. She contacted Eddie Tate again, not with a complaint, but with a proposal for another purchase. She would lure him to a place of her choosing, the Sycamore Lake Apartments in the 2100 block of Westchester Circle, a place she knew well because she lived there. The pretense was another sale, but the intent was robbery, a plan to reclaim her $250 by force. On the night of Friday, January 22nd, 2016, the air in Memphis was cold and heavy with the weight of impending tragedy. Shelby Isaac set her plan in motion. She was not alone. With her was her friend, Victoria C., who would later become the prosecution's star witness, her testimony a shaky pillar in a case built on shifting sands. According to C., she drove Shelby to the apartments. The two of them waited. Eddie Tate arrived, his car cutting through the darkness of the apartment complex parking lot. He was not alone either. In the passenger seat was Edwina, his pregnant girlfriend, an unwitting passenger on a journey to her own demise. They pulled up, expecting another routine transaction. What happened next was a blur of violence, a sudden and brutal eruption that shattered the night's quiet. According to Victoria C.'s later testimony, Shelby Isaac got out of C's car and approached Tate's vehicle. C said she saw Shelby with a black gun. Then, the first gunshot rang out, a sharp, deafening crack that sent C fleeing in panic. Inside the car, a scene of unimaginable horror unfolded. Shelby Isaac, prosecutors would later argue, opened fire on the vehicle, her rage focused on Eddie Tate. He was shot, the bullets tearing through his body. But the violence did not end there. Edwina Thomas, in the passenger seat, was also hit. She was caught in the crossfire, a victim of a rage that was not even directed at her. And with her, the tiny, nascent life inside her was also extinguished. In the chaotic aftermath, as the echoes of the gunshots faded into the cold night air, Shelby Isaac's actions allegedly took an even more chilling turn. One witness, Gary Dotson, would later testify that he saw her after the shooting with a wad of cash and blood on her clothes. Other witnesses claimed they saw her go through Eddie Tate's pockets as he lay dying, a final, macabre act of retrieval. The $250 she had set out to reclaim was now stained with the blood of 3 lives. Victoria C., who had fled at the sound of the first shot, said she later returned to pick up Shelby. She testified that Shelby confessed to her, the words a stark admission of the horror that had just transpired. The two friends, now bound by a terrible secret, drove away, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would soon draw the flashing lights of police cars and the somber gaze of detectives. When the Memphis police arrived at the Sycamore Lake Apartments, they found a scene of devastating violence. The car, riddled with bullet holes, was a tomb. Inside, Eddie Tate and Edwina Thomas were dead, their bodies a testament to the brutal finality of gunfire. The knowledge that Edwina was pregnant added another layer of tragedy to the crime. This was not a double homicide, it was a triple homicide. 3 lives, one of which had barely begun, had been stolen over a dispute about hair extensions. The investigation began, a methodical process of gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses in the hope of piecing together the fractured narrative of the crime. The initial challenge for investigators was the lack of direct physical evidence. No murder weapon was found at the scene. No fingerprints on the car's exterior could be definitively linked to a suspect. The residents of the Sycamore Lake Apartments, a community now shaken by violence, could not identify Shelby Isaac as being at the crime scene, despite the fact that she lived there. The case hinged on the people who were there, the individuals caught in the orbit of the crime. The first break came from Victoria C. Her initial statements to the police were a web of lies and denials. For hours, she told investigators that she knew nothing about what had happened. The fear of being implicated in a triple murder was a powerful motivator. But as the pressure mounted, her story began to change. She eventually admitted to being there, to driving Shelby to the apartments, and to seeing her with a gun. Her testimony, though riddled with inconsistencies and self-preservation, would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The second crucial piece of evidence was found inside Eddie Tate's car. It was a receipt, a flimsy piece of paper that could have easily been overlooked. But on that receipt, investigators found a fingerprint. It belonged to Shelby Isaac. For the prosecution, this was the physical link they needed, proof that Shelby had been in that car. For the defense, it was a red herring, a piece of evidence that could be easily explained away. Shelby had been in Tate's car before, during the initial purchase of the hair weaves. Her fingerprint on a receipt was not proof of murder, they would argue, but simply evidence of a prior, legitimate transaction. With C's testimony and the fingerprint, the district attorney's office felt they had enough to move forward. Shelby Isaac was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The 19-year-old girl with no criminal record was now facing the possibility of life in prison, accused of a crime of shocking brutality, a crime born from a dispute over $250. The trial of Shelby Isaac began in November 2017, nearly 2 years after the murders. The courtroom was a theater of grief and accusation. On one side sat Shelby Isaac, a young woman whose life had taken a dark and violent turn. On the other side sat the families of the victims, their faces etched with a pain that time had not healed. Gloria Tate, Eddie's mother, was there every day, a silent, grieving presence. "We had a bond that was inseparable," she would later say of her son. "As we go along, I don't think I'll ever be the same again because there's a void in my life that can't be filled. When your heart is broken, there's nothing that anybody can say or do about it." The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorneys Glenn Beatty and Gavin Smith, painted a picture of a cold and calculated killer. "She lured that man to his death," Beatty told the jury in his closing argument. They argued that Shelby's motive was clear. She wanted her money back and was willing to kill to get it. They presented their evidence, piece by piece. They called Gary Dotson, who testified to seeing Shelby with cash and blood on her clothes. They presented the fingerprint on the receipt, a tangible link between the accused and the crime scene. But the heart of their case was Victoria C. On the stand, she recounted her version of the events of that night, her voice a mixture of fear and reluctance. She told the jury that she saw Shelby with a gun, that she heard the gunshot, and that Shelby later confessed to her. But under cross-examination by defense attorney Lauren Fuchs, C's credibility began to crumble. Fuchs relentlessly attacked C's testimony, pointing out the numerous inconsistencies in her story. She reminded the jury that C had lied to her mother, to the police, and even under oath at a preliminary hearing. "Can you believe her?" Fuchs asked the jury, her voice dripping with skepticism. "After all the inconsistencies that she has admitted to? Lying to her mother, lying to the police, lying to judges, lying to attorneys, lying to friends. Can you believe her?" Fuchs argued that C was an unreliable witness, a co-defendant who was testifying against Shelby to save herself. The defense's strategy was to create reasonable doubt. They argued that there was no physical evidence tying Shelby to the crime. No murder weapon was ever found. No DNA evidence linked her to the scene. The only person placing her there was Victoria C., a confessed liar. The fingerprint, they argued, was meaningless, a remnant of a previous, innocent interaction. Lauren Fuchs portrayed Shelby as a scapegoat, a young woman with no criminal past who was being framed by a desperate co-defendant. "When you follow the credible and unbiased evidence in this case, it does not lead you to Shelby Isaac," she told the jury. The jury was left to grapple with a case that was far from clear-cut. On one hand, there was the horror of the crime, a young couple and their unborn child, their lives extinguished in a hail of bullets over a trivial amount of money. On the other hand, there was the weakness of the evidence, a case built on the testimony of a single, unreliable witness. The jury deliberated, the weight of 3 lives in their hands. After days of deliberation, they reached a verdict. The courtroom was hushed as the foreperson handed the verdict forms to Judge James Lammy. Shelby Isaac stood, her face pale, her future hanging in the balance. The judge began to read. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder." At the word guilty, a guttural cry escaped Shelby Isaac's lips. She collapsed, her body slumping to the floor as if the weight of the verdict had crushed her. "Mommy," she screamed, her voice a primal wail of despair that echoed through the silent courtroom. Her family wept openly. The jurors, who had just sealed her fate, covered their faces, some of them visibly shaken by the raw, visceral display of grief and terror. Shelby had to be carried from the courtroom, her screams still audible from another room. The jury had not convicted her of first-degree murder, the charge the prosecution had sought. They had found her guilty of lesser charges, a verdict that reflected the ambiguities of the case. For the death of Eddie Tate, she was convicted of second-degree murder. For the death of Edwina Thomas, she was convicted of reckless homicide. And for the death of the unborn baby, she was convicted of criminally negligent homicide. It was a nuanced verdict, a legal distinction that did little to assuage the grief of the victims' families or the despair of the defendants. In February 2018, Shelby Isaac returned to court for sentencing. The raw emotion of the verdict had subsided, replaced by a quiet resignation. She sat silently, her head bowed, as Judge Lammy handed down her sentence. For the murder of Eddie Tate, for the reckless killing of Edwina Thomas, for the criminally negligent death of an unborn child, Shelby Isaac was sentenced to a total of 30 years in prison. The case of Shelby Isaac is a story of a life irrevocably altered, a future erased, over a dispute of such triviality that it defies comprehension. It is a story of the devastating consequences of a moment of rage, of the ease with which a life can be taken, and the long, painful road to a justice that can never truly heal the wounds of loss. For Gloria Tate, the pain of losing her son is a constant companion, a void that can never be filled. For Shelby Isaac, the next 3 decades of her life will be spent behind bars, a prisoner of a decision made in a moment of anger, a decision that cost 3 lives and destroyed her own. The hair weaves that sparked the tragedy have long since been forgotten, but the echoes of the gunshots that rang out on that cold January night in Memphis will reverberate forever in the lives of all who were touched by this senseless act of violence. Story 6. In the sleepy town of Bellevue, Florida, where the air hung heavy with the scent of pine and the distant hum of cicadas filled summer evenings, Seth Tyler Jackson came into the world on a crisp February day in 1996. Born to Scott and Sonia Jackson, he was a boy with red hair that caught the sunlight like flames and eyes that sparkled with the unfiltered curiosity of youth. Life in Bellevue was unhurried, a patchwork of modest homes and open fields where kids like Seth spent afternoons riding bikes down dusty roads or splashing in the shallow creeks that wound through the landscape. Scott worked long hours as a mechanic, his hands perpetually stained with grease, providing for his family with a quiet determination born from years of scraping by. Sonia, his mother, was the heart of the home, her laughter a warm counterpoint to the daily grind, always ready with a hug or a homemade meal that filled the small kitchen with comforting aromas. Seth was their only child, doted on in ways that made him feel like the center of their universe. Yet he carried a restless energy, a longing for something more than the familiar routines of small-town life. As Seth grew, so did his spirit. By middle school, he was the kid who turned heads, not just for his striking red hair, which he wore long and tousled, but for his easy charm and infectious smile. He was athletic, quick on his feet during pickup basketball games at the local park, and had a knack for making friends with a single joke or shared secret. But beneath that outgoing facade, Seth navigated the awkward turbulence of adolescence. His parents' divorce when he was young had left subtle scars. Scott remarried, blending families, but Seth often felt like the outsider in the new dynamic. He lived mostly with his mother, Sonia, in a trailer on the edge of town, where the nights were quiet except for the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. School was a mixed bag. Good grades when he applied himself, but distractions pulled at him, like the allure of social media, where he could craft an image of himself that felt larger than life. Facebook became his window to the world, a place to post photos of his escapades, connect with girls, and escape the monotony. It was there, in the digital glow of a screen, that he first crossed paths with Amber Wright. Amber was 15, the same age as Seth, when their stories intertwined in the spring of 2010. She lived a few miles away in a cluttered mobile home shared with her mother, Tracy, her stepfather, Dwayne Hooper, and her younger siblings, including her stepbrother Kyle. Tracy's life was a whirlwind of shifts at low-paying jobs, her days blending into nights of exhaustion, while Dwayne's temper simmered like a pot left too long on the stove. Amber, with her dark hair and sharp features, had a beauty that turned heads, but it masked a deeper vulnerability. Her family dynamics were strained, marked by arguments that echoed through thin walls and a sense of instability that left her seeking stability in relationships. She was popular in her circle, the girl who knew everyone's secrets, but friends later described her as quick to hold grudges, her emotions flaring hot and fast like summer storms. School for Amber was a social battlefield. She navigated cliques with a mix of confidence and insecurity, often turning to Facebook to vent frustrations or flirt from afar. Their connection sparked online, as so many teenage romances did in those pre-smartphone days when every notification felt like a thrill. Seth messaged her first, drawn to her profile pictures that showed her laughing at parties or posing with friends. Amber responded, her replies witty and inviting, and soon they were chatting daily, about school drama, favorite bands, dreams of escaping Bellevue for bigger adventures. By summer, they were official, stealing kisses behind the bleachers at Friday night football games and driving around in Seth's beat-up truck, windows down, radio blasting. Seth was smitten. He posted pictures of them together, calling her his ride or die, in captions that overflowed with young love. Amber seemed equally caught up, confiding in him about her family troubles, the way her stepfather's anger made home feel unsafe. For Seth, she was a breath of fresh air, someone who saw him as more than just the red-headed kid from down the road. They spent hours at the local quarry, skipping stones across the water-filled pits left from old mining operations, talking about futures that seemed infinite. But paradise in teenage love rarely lasts unchallenged. Cracks appeared by early 2011, subtle at first, a missed call here, a snappy text there. Seth's jealousy flared when Amber mentioned other guys, and her possessiveness matched his, leading to arguments that escalated quickly. One night in March, after a party where Seth flirted too openly with another girl, Amber exploded. Words flew like daggers over the phone. Accusations of cheating, threats to end it all. Seth, hurt and defensive, fired back, calling her controlling. The breakup was messy, public on Facebook where friends picked sides and comments piled up like debris after a wreck. Amber posted cryptic statuses about betrayal, her hurt morphing into rage as she rallied her inner circle. Seth, meanwhile, tried to play it cool, but the sting lingered. He missed her, but pride kept him from reaching out first. Enter Michael Bargo. At 18, Michael was older, edgier, with a reputation for trouble that made him magnetic to girls like Amber seeking escape. He lived with his friend Charlie Ely in her mobile home on US 301, a place cluttered with the remnants of transient lives. Empty beer cans, scattered clothes, the faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to everything. Charlie, also 18, was the level-headed one, working odd jobs and trying to keep her home from descending into chaos. Michael, however, burned with intensity. He had a history of petty crimes, run-ins with the law that painted him as a rebel without a cause. Tall and lean, with tattoos snaking up his arms, he spoke in absolutes, drawing people in with tales of grand plans that never quite materialized. Amber met him through mutual friends shortly after the split with Seth, and the chemistry was immediate. Michael listened to her vent about the breakup, his arm around her shoulders, promising protection from anyone who hurt her. "That guy's trash," he'd say, his voice low and convincing. "You deserve better." Amber, still raw from the rejection, leaned into the attention, posting photos of them together almost defiantly, as if to prove to the world, and to Seth, that she had moved on. The tension simmered through April 2011, a pressure cooker of teenage drama amplified by social media. Seth couldn't let go. He messaged Amber sporadically, apologies mixed with pleas, but she rebuffed him, her responses laced with venom. Rumors swirled in their shared friend group. Seth had hit her once during an argument, or so Amber claimed, though details blurred in retellings. Friends like Justin Soto, a 20-year-old with a laid-back vibe and a penchant for partying, heard both sides but aligned with Amber, drawn into Michael's orbit. Justin lived nearby, often crashing at Charlie's, where the group gathered to smoke, drink, and plot against perceived enemies. Kyle Hooper, Amber's 16-year-old stepbrother, was the wild card, loyal to his stepsister, impressionable, and eager to prove himself in the older crowd. He looked up to Michael, hanging on his every word, his own home life a mirror of Amber's instability. By mid-April, the online feud had escalated into real threats. Seth posted a photo of himself with a gun, captioned with a vague warning, his frustration boiling over. Amber saw it and seethed, showing it to Michael during one of their late-night hangouts at Charlie's. The room was dim, lit by the flicker of a television no one watched, the air thick with tension. Michael paced, his fists clenched. "He's threatening you," he said, his voice rising. "We can't let that slide." Amber nodded, tears welling, her fear genuine or amplified. She later claimed both. What started as venting turned into something darker. Michael suggested they handle it, his words casual but loaded. The group brainstormed in hushed tones, scare Seth, make him back off. But as the night wore on, fueled by alcohol and bravado, the talk shifted. "What if we just end it?" Michael proposed, half joking at first. The others laughed nervously, but the seed was planted. Amber, wiping her eyes, whispered, "He deserves it." In that moment, the line between anger and action blurred, and a plan coalesced. Not just a confrontation, but something final, irreversible. The evening of April 17th, 2011, unfolded like any other in Bellevue's humid spring dusk. Seth was at home with his mother, Sonia, helping with dinner, the kitchen filled with the sizzle of burgers on the stove. At 15, he was at that awkward cusp of boyhood and manhood, his red hair tied back, his frame still filling out from growth spurts. Sonia noticed his mood was lighter. He'd mentioned texting Amber earlier, hoping for reconciliation. "Be careful, honey," she said, her maternal instinct prickling. But Seth brushed it off, excited when his phone buzzed with a message from Amber. "We need to talk. Come over?" His heart raced. Maybe this was it, a chance to fix things. He grabbed his keys, told Sonia he'd be back soon, and headed out into the twilight, the gravel crunching under his tires as he drove the short distance to the address she gave. Charlie Ely's mobile home on East State Road 35. The home was unassuming, a single-wide trailer with peeling paint and a chain-link fence sagging in places. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of fast food and unwashed laundry. Charlie lounged on the couch, scrolling her phone, while Justin and Kyle fiddled with a video game controller. Michael paced in the kitchen, his energy coiled like a spring. Amber sat at the dining table, her fingers tapping nervously, a half-smile playing on her lips as she watched the door. They had prepared, a bat hidden behind the couch, a gun, Justin Soto's .22 caliber pistol, tucked in a drawer, and bottles of bleach ready for cleanup. The plan was simple in its brutality. Lure Seth in, ambush him in the shower where he was supposedly meeting Amber, beat him senseless, shoot him if needed, then dispose of the body in the backyard fire pit. Michael had insisted on the details, assigning roles like a twisted director. Kyle and Justin on the initial attack, he on the finish, Amber to keep watch and calm. Charlie, reluctant but swept up, agreed to provide the space, her discomfort buried under group pressure. Seth pulled up around 9:30 p.m., the headlights sweeping across the yard before cutting off. He knocked, his knock tentative, hopeful. Amber opened the door, her face a mask of sweetness. "Hey," she said softly, pulling him inside with a quick hug that felt almost real. Seth smiled, relief washing over him. "I missed you," he murmured, oblivious to the eyes watching from the shadows. She led him to the bathroom, the door ajar, steam from a running shower filling the small space to sell the ruse. "Wait here," she whispered, her hand lingering on his arm. Seth nodded, stepping in, his back to the living room as he called out a joke about joining her soon. The attack came swift and savage. Kyle and Justin burst from their hiding spots, bats swinging. The first blow caught Seth across the shoulders, sending him crashing into the sink with a yelp of surprise and pain. "What the Amber?" he gasped, twisting to see her in the doorway, her expression unchanging. Michael followed, grabbing Seth by the hair, dragging him toward the shower as punches rained down. Seth fought back, his fists connecting with Kyle's jaw, but the numbers overwhelmed him. They beat him mercilessly, bat to ribs, fists to face, blood splattering the white tiles like abstract art gone wrong. Seth's screams echoed, pleading, "Stop. Amber, why?" But Amber stood frozen, her role shifting from lure to witness, the reality hitting her in waves she couldn't process. They hauled his battered body to the master bedroom, where Michael took over. Seth, gasping through broken teeth, begged for his life. "Please. I didn't do anything." Michael's face was stone, his voice cold. "You hurt her." The .22 fired 3 times, once in the shoulder, twisting Seth in agony, once in the head, silencing his cries, and a final shot to ensure. The room fell quiet, save for the ragged breathing of the group. Seth lay still, his red hair matted with blood. His dreams of reconciliation ended in a pool of crimson on the carpet. Panic set in, but Michael snapped them into action. They wrapped Seth's body in a sheet, the weight heavier than expected, his limbs limp as they carried him to the backyard. The fire pit, a rusted metal ring surrounded by cinder blocks, awaited. They poured gasoline, added firewood, and ignited it, the flames roaring to life under the starry sky. For hours they fed the blaze, first the body, then clothes, the bat, anything tainted. The smell was acrid, choking, a mix of burning flesh and chemicals that made Charlie retch into the bushes. Amber hovered nearby, her hands trembling as she sprinkled bleach around the house, erasing traces. By dawn, the fire had reduced Seth to fragments, bones charred, skin ash. They gathered the remains into 2 5-gallon paint buckets, the sludge heavy and grotesque, then drove to a nearby limestone quarry, the water black and still in the early light. With a splash that echoed like finality, they dumped him, watching bubbles rise before driving away, the buckets tossed into a pond. The morning after, April 18th, Bellevue stirred unaware. Sonia Jackson woke to an empty house, Seth's truck gone since the night before. Worry gnawed at her. She called his phone, no answer. Friends hadn't seen him. By afternoon, dread turned to action. She filed a missing person report with the Marion County Sheriff's Office. Detectives arrived at the trailer, the faint smell of smoke lingering. Tracy's unease grew. Her daughter Amber seemed off, evasive. "She knows something," Tracy thought, confronting her. Amber cracked under the pressure, tearfully confessing pieces to her mother, who dragged her to the station. At the sheriff's office, the interviews began. Detective Rhonda Stroop, a seasoned investigator with a calm demeanor that masked her sharpness, sat with Amber first. The girl was fidgety, denying at first, but the lies crumbled. In a second session, more aggressive, Stroop pressed. "Your brother Kyle's talking. He says you lured him." Amber's resolve broke. She admitted her role, detailing the plan, the beating, the fire. But a procedural error loomed, Miranda rights not read timely. Kyle confessed too, his voice shaking as he described the bat swings. Justin and Michael followed, their stories aligning in horrific detail. Charlie, tearful, admitted providing the space. By evening, all were arrested, the trailer taped off as a crime scene. The investigation unfolded rapidly. Divers scoured the quarry, recovering bone fragments and teeth that dental records confirmed as Seth's. Blood evidence in the bathroom, the bedroom carpet soaked through, the fire pit's ashes yielding charred remains. All pointed to murder. Autopsy details painted a grim picture. Seth had suffered blunt force trauma fracturing his skull and ribs, gunshot wounds to vital areas, and thermal burns that charred his body beyond recognition. The brutality shocked the community. Vigils sprang up, candles flickering for the boy everyone knew. Trials commenced in 2012, a media storm enveloping quiet Bellevue. Michael Bargo, the ringleader, faced first-degree murder charges. His trial in March revealed the full extent of his manipulation, texts plotting the killing, his insistence on no mercy. Witnesses, including the defendants turning on each other, testified to the plan's premeditation. Jurors, faces grim, convicted him after days, sentencing him to death by lethal injection, a rare outcome for a teen mastermind. Justin Soto, the gun provider, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, receiving life without parole. His remorse in court rang hollow against the evidence. Charlie Ely, the reluctant host, took a plea for lesser charges, sentenced to life with parole possibility after 25 years, her tears a mix of regret and survival. Kyle Hooper, Amber's stepbrother, convicted of first degree, got life, his youth no shield against the savagery. Amber's turn came amid controversy. Tried as an adult at 17, her 2012 conviction for first-degree murder led to life without parole. But appeals overturned it in 2014, the Miranda violation tainting her confession, interviews deemed coercive. Retrial in January 2016 replayed the nightmare. Prosecutors, led by Amy Burnt, built a case without the tape, witness testimonies, texts, physical evidence. Amber took the stand, her voice steady but eyes downcast, claiming coercion by Michael, fear driving her actions. "I didn't want him dead," she said, but jurors saw the lure, the planning. After 2 hours, guilty again. Sentencing in February brought Judge Anthony Toddy's words. "I have not seen or heard anything more despicable. Life, review after 25 years, eligibility in 2041. Sonia Jackson sat through it all, her face etched with grief that time couldn't erase. Seth's death hollowed her. She spoke at sentencing's voice breaking. "My son was taken for nothing, a stupid fight." Scott, too, mourned the boy who'd never graduate, never chased dreams. The quarry became a memorial site, flowers floating on the water. Bellevue changed. Parents monitored phones closer, trust fractured. Years on, the case lingers as a cautionary echo. Michael awaits execution on death row, appeals grinding. Justin and Kyle serve in Florida prisons. Charlie paroled in 2020 after good behavior, rebuilding quietly. Amber, now in her late 20s, resides at Homestead Correctional Institution, her sentence a long road to possible release. The fire pit is gone, the trailer demolished, but Seth's story endures, a reminder of how anger, unchecked, devours innocence. In Bellevue's quiet nights, the cicadas still hum, but now they carry the weight of what was lost. Story 7. There may be danger that hides in plain sight, wearing a friendly smile and buying a round of drinks. It does not lurk in dark alleys or announce itself with menace. It sits at the end of the bar, laughs at your jokes, tells you that you are beautiful, and offers you a ride home. 4 women across 4 different states in the autumn of 1995. That danger had a name, Glenn Rogers. He was handsome, he was charming, and by the time anyone understood what he really was, he had already moved on to find someone new. Glenn Edward Rogers was born on July 15, 1962, in Hamilton, Ohio, the 4th of 7 children in a family that offered him nothing resembling safety. His father, Claude, worked at a local paper mill and drank heavily, and according to those who studied Rogers's life in later years, he beat his wife and children on what amounted to a daily basis. His mother, rather than shielding her children from that violence, was reportedly abusive in her own right. It is the kind of childhood that forensic psychologists point to again and again when trying to explain how a person becomes capable of terrible things, not as an excuse, but as an origin story written in bruises and fear long before anyone else ever got hurt. By the time Glenn Rogers was a teenager, he had already begun stealing food to survive, and that early theft would eventually curdle into forgery, arson, and a pattern of disorderly conduct that followed him through his young adult life. At 17, Rogers married his teenage girlfriend, a young woman named Deborah and Nix, whom he had gotten pregnant. They had a second child together in 1981, but the marriage was marked by violence, and in 1983 Nix filed for divorce, citing physical abuse. A second marriage followed the same pattern. Rogers could not seem to build a life without brutality running through its foundation, and in time, that brutality escaped the confines of his own household and reached out toward strangers. Before he ever crossed state lines as a killer, Rogers left a body behind in his hometown. In October of 1993, a 71-year-old retired electrician and veteran named Mark Peters vanished, along with his car, his antiques, his guns, and a coin collection he had spent years assembling. Peters had done something kind for Glenn Rogers. He had taken him in, given him a place to live when Rogers had nowhere else to go. That kindness, it seems, was answered with betrayal. Rogers disappeared at the same time Peters did, and police in Hamilton suspected almost immediately that something was wrong, but jurisdictional confusion and simple bad luck meant that no one moved quickly enough to stop what came next. It would be Rogers' own brother, Clay, who eventually led investigators to a family cabin in Beattyville, Kentucky, where on January 10, 1994, officers found Mark Peters' remains bound to a chair and buried beneath a pile of furniture. It was a chilling discovery, and yet even with a body in hand and a prime suspect already known to police, the machinery of justice failed to close its grip on Glenn Rogers. Detectives in Ohio prepared to question him. A planned interview was canceled at the last minute over doubts it would prove useful. Authorities in Kentucky, believing others were pursuing him, quietly dropped an unrelated burglary charge that might have kept him in custody. Each small failure was reasonable in isolation. Together, they left a dangerous man free to keep moving. By 1995, Rogers had drifted west to Los Angeles, working odd jobs in construction and traveling carnivals, the kind of transient life that let him vanish easily and reappear somewhere new. He was by every account magnetic. He had long, sandy blonde hair, an easy smile, and a gift for making whoever he was speaking with feel like the most interesting person in the room. He bought drinks freely. He complimented women in a way that felt sincere rather than predatory, at least at first. This charm was not incidental to what he did. It was the tool he used to get close enough to hurt people. In Los Angeles that summer, his violent temper resurfaced in ugly, well-documented ways. In June, he attacked two men with a knife inside his Hollywood apartment building, trapping one of them inside an elevator with a blade at his throat. He pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, yet a county work release program aimed at easing jail overcrowding let him out after just 42 days. Free again, he moved in with a girlfriend named Maria Jor, a bartender at a Van Nuys lounge, and terrorized her with drunken, jealous rages so severe that her employer fired her simply to keep him away from the workplace. In late August, he threw her and her belongings out of their shared apartment. She and her brother filed a police report. Rogers was arrested for spousal battery, a charge that, combined with his existing probation, might have sent him back to jail for years. Instead, a court commissioner facing hundreds of cases a day handed him a standard sentence of 2 days behind bars. Maria Jor fled to Hungary, fearing for her life. For weeks after Rogers walked out of that courtroom a free man, a woman named Sandra Gallagher was dead. Sandra Gallagher was 33 years old, a recently separated mother of 3, the kind of woman who still believed the best evening plans were simple ones. A night out with friends, maybe a little luck at the bar. On September 28, 1995, luck did seem to find her. She won $1,200 playing the lottery and went to McCred's Cocktail Lounge in Van Nuys to celebrate, calling her estranged husband that night to share the good news. She was in high spirits. At the bar, she met Glenn Rogers, a regular there, well-liked, generous with his money, and by every account extremely charming that evening. Employees remembered her leaving with him around 1 in the morning. It should have been an unremarkable end to a good night. Instead, it was the beginning of the end of her life. The next morning, firefighters responded to a vehicle fire behind a convalescent home in Van Nuys. Inside the burning truck, they found a badly charred body, and the strong smell of gasoline told them immediately that this was no accident. Someone had deliberately poured fuel over the victim in an apparent attempt to erase evidence. A nurse arriving for her early shift told police she had seen a man with long blonde hair standing beside the truck, tossing items into a nearby trash bin, calm and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Identification recovered at the scene confirmed what investigators feared. The body belonged to Sandra Gallagher. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled to death before the fire was set, which meant the burning was not the cause of her death, but an attempt to hide it. When police traced her last hours back to Macread's and learned the name of the man she had left with, they went to Rogers's apartment with a search warrant. It was empty. He had already disappeared, leaving almost nothing behind. A warrant went out for his arrest, entered into national law enforcement databases, but Glenn Rogers was already hundreds of miles away, and he was not finished. He surfaced next in Jackson, Mississippi at the State Fair in early October. There, amid the lights and the noise and the ordinary joy of a small-town autumn tradition, he met a woman named Linda Price, a 34-year-old single mother of 2 with striking red hair. She fell for him almost instantly. Her sister, Marilyn Williams, would later recall Linda's excitement with an ache that never fully faded. "I think I found the man of my dreams. He's going to be the love of my life," Linda had said. It is one of the most heartbreaking details in this entire case. A woman's genuine hope captured in a single sentence, spoken without any idea of what was coming. Rogers and Price moved quickly, sharing an apartment within weeks of meeting. But cracks appeared almost as fast as the romance had bloomed. On October 30th, while out on a double date with her sister, Linda pulled Marilyn aside during a bathroom break and said something that still carries the weight of prophecy. If something happened to her, she told her sister, do not let him get away with it. Moments later, an enraged Rogers pounded on the bathroom door, demanding Linda come out and leave with him. Marilyn described the scene as frightening. It was the last time she ever saw her sister alive. Days later, after a worried call from Linda's mother, police performed a welfare check at the apartment and found her body in the bathtub, stabbed repeatedly in the upper body, her neck slashed. Bloody paper towels and a mop suggested someone had tried, imperfectly, to clean up what he had done. Rogers was already gone, spotted driving away in a red pickup truck days earlier. By now, investigators across state lines were beginning to see the pattern connecting these deaths, and the FBI joined the search, alarmed by what one detective described as Rogers's volatility and the sheer viciousness of his crimes. But information moved slower than Rogers did. He traveled on to Tampa, Florida, and there, on November 5th, he crossed paths with Tina Marie Cribbs, a hotel housekeeper and single mother of 2 who had gone out that night with her own mother, Mary Dick, to the Showtown bar in nearby Gibsonton. A blonde-haired, bearded stranger approached their table, charming and generous, buying rounds for the group. Mary needed to leave for a while and told her daughter she would be back within the hour. When she returned, Tina was gone. 2 days later, a housekeeper at the Tampa 8 Inn discovered Tina's body in a bathtub inside a room registered under Glenn Rogers' name. Stabbed beneath the breast and in the buttock, blood-soaked towels scattered across the floor. Rogers had even left a handwritten, "Do not disturb" sign on the door before fleeing in her white Ford Festiva, buying himself precious extra time before anyone would think to check the room. His path did not stop there. He continued on to Bossier City, Louisiana, where he reconnected with a woman he had briefly known before, Andy Giles Sutton, a 37-year-old divorced mother of 4, another redhead. Her roommate said Sutton had first met Rogers at a bar on November 2nd, and after he briefly left for Florida, the two reunited on November 8th. That night, they got into a serious argument at a bar. The next morning, Sutton's roommate found her dead in bed, stabbed multiple times, her waterbed punctured beneath her. For women, for states, roughly 6 weeks. Investigators studying the pattern noticed something else too. something that pointed toward the deeper wound at the center of this entire story. Nearly all of his victims were women in their 30s with red or reddish hair, and one forensic psychologist later suggested they may have functioned, in his mind, as substitutes for the mother whose abuse he had never escaped. The manhunt that followed captured a nation's attention. Glenn Rogers' own mother appeared on television, tearfully begging her son to surrender. "I'm begging you," she said, "please give up." He did not listen. On November 13, 1995, his aunt in Beattyville, Kentucky, called authorities to report that Rogers had just visited her home. It was the break investigators had been waiting for. A Kentucky State Police detective named Robert Stevens happened to spot the stolen Ford Festiva along a stretch of highway and began to follow. Rogers noticed the tail and bolted, launching a high-speed chase that stretched roughly 13 miles down Kentucky roads, other officers joining in as the pursuit unfolded live in front of a local television crew that happened to be filming. A trooper fired a shotgun blast at the fleeing car's rear tires, but it was not enough to stop him. Finally, a sergeant rammed his patrol car into the stolen Festiva, spinning Rogers off the road into a ditch, where officers surrounded and arrested him. When questioned, Rogers initially bragged that he had committed nearly 70 murders, before recanting and insisting he had been joking, that he had killed no one at all. The trials that followed took years and unfolded across 2 states, each one determined to hold him accountable for the woman killed on their soil. In Florida, prosecutors focused on the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. Rogers stood trial from April 28 through May 9, 1997, and was convicted on all counts: first-degree murder, armed robbery, and grand theft of a motor vehicle. He was sentenced to death. Then in California, prosecutors pursued him for the killing of Sandra Gallagher. That trial, in the summer of 1999, featured the unusual spectacle of Rogers taking the witness stand in his own defense, trying to present himself, as one prosecutor mockingly put it, with a good guy image the jury simply did not believe. On June 22, 1999, he was convicted of first-degree murder and arson, and on July 16, California handed down its own sentence of death. Authorities in Mississippi and Louisiana ultimately chose not to pursue separate trials for the murders of Linda Price and Andy Giles Sutton, reasoning that 2 death sentences already secured the only outcome the law could offer. Glenn Rogers would spend almost 30 years on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, his case shadowed for much of that time by a strange and unproven claim that connected him to one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history, the 1994 killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Rogers and his brother Clay would later suggest, through letters, paintings, and taped interviews with a criminal profiler, that Rogers had been hired by O.J. Simpson himself to break into Nicole Brown Simpson's home, and that violence had spiraled beyond what was intended. The Los Angeles Police Department publicly rejected the claim, stating flatly that they knew who was responsible for those deaths and had no reason to believe Rogers was involved, and Ron Goldman's father echoed that same certainty. The theory added a strange, unresolved footnote to an already dark biography, but it never altered the verdicts already rendered against him. For nearly 3 decades, the families of his victims lived with a peculiar, aching form of limbo, the knowledge that the man responsible for their loss was alive, housed, fed, and simply waiting, while the people he had destroyed stayed gone. That limbo ended on April 15, 2025, when Florida's governor signed a death warrant setting Rogers' execution for May 15. His attorneys made a final push in the weeks that followed, arguing that childhood abuse and trafficking he had suffered should have been weighed more heavily during his original sentencing, invoking newly passed legislation in hopes of reopening that question. The Florida Supreme Court denied the appeal on May 9th. A last request to the Supreme Court of the United States was rejected on May 14th, the day before he was scheduled to die. On May 15th, 2025, at Florida State Prison, Glenn Rogers was executed by lethal injection. He was 62 years old. His final meal was pizza, chocolate cake, and soda, small, almost mundane comforts chosen by a man who had spent his life stealing comfort and peace from others. In his last statement, he addressed the families of the women he had killed directly, telling them he understood they still carried unanswered questions, and promising, cryptically, that answers would come and bring them some form of closure. He was declared dead at 6:16 p.m. The people left behind did not receive tidy resolution, but they did, finally, receive an ending. Jerry Vallicella, Sandra Gallagher's sister, said she could finally rest, having waited nearly 30 years to see the sentence carried out, and that his death offered her family a sense of safety they had not felt in decades. Debbie Spikes, Linda Price's older sister, attended the execution alongside her husband, her own sister, and her mother, and said afterward that her family had found closure, even as she voiced lasting anger that Rogers had never shown genuine remorse. Randy Roberson, the son of Andy Giles Sutton, said the execution brought him closure too, but added a complicated, painfully human observation: that watching Rogers die by lethal injection looked almost peaceful, like a man simply falling asleep, and that this peace felt like too gentle an ending for the violence he had inflicted. There is no way to make this story comfortable, and it should not be made comfortable, because comfort was never something Glenn Rogers offered the women whose lives he ended. Instead is a record of exactly how fragile safety can be, of how many small, reasonable decisions by overworked courts and understaffed police departments accumulated into one avoidable tragedy after another, and of how ordinary trust, in a stranger's smile at a bar, in a bright afternoon at a state fair, in a shared drink after a long day, became the very thing that cost 4 women their lives. Sandra Gallagher, Linda Price, Tina Marie Cribbs, and Andy Giles Sutton were mothers, sisters, daughters, women with futures they were still building when Glenn Rogers entered their lives and ended them. Their names deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to his story, but as the true center of it, for lives cut short by a man whose charm was, in the end, the most dangerous weapon he ever carried.